it might be oversimplifying, but the way I generally describe sleep to patients is sort of a balancing act between adenosine, cortisol, and melatonin. And you've got to these three things have to they're like an orchestra. You have to have the crescendo of adenosine with the decrescendo of cortisol, and then you have to let melatonin take the brakes off this whole thing. And, even when I just think about myself personally, I am convinced that virtually all of my sleep woes are on the cortisol axis. And the reason I'm hypothesizing that is I can't measure adenosine. It's very complicated to measure. You need a very special type of mass spec to do that, or MRS. But we can measure melatonin in urine. We can collect urine overnight and measure melatonin levels. So we have at least some sense of how much we're making. But because I measure glucose 24 hours a day, and I'm pretty familiar with meal timing and response, in many ways, nighttime glucose for me is a proxy for nighttime cortisol. And the association between high nighttime glucose and poor sleep is overwhelming. And I suspect it's through this cortisol axis.
There is, in some ways, a manipulation that we'll speak about in just probably a little while of adenosine. Even though you can't measure it, you can actually manipulate it with something called caffeine. And that can demonstrate to you.
Matt, by the way, we're in America here. I don't think there's a human that doesn't know what caffeine is. You get everybody's ears perked up like you're going to mention some new compound you just discovered in the lab yesterday.
Yeah. Somnus squared. No, it's called caffeine. But what's interesting regarding cortisol, which really supports your hypothesis, right now, the leading underlying mechanism, the leading theory of insomnia essentially comes back to that fight or flight branch of the nervous system, that you are in this profound parasympathetic state where that nervous system is cranked too far in sort of the high strength direction. And if you essentially have a cannula and you sample cortisol every 30 minutes across a 24-hour period, you see this, this nice rise during the day where cortisol is helping you stay awake, it's keeping you alert, it's doing all of the things that it needs to do. And then as you start to come towards the nighttime period, cortisol should drop and needs to drop for you to be able to initiate sleep. And in fact, it usually hits its sort of almost its nadir at the point where most people will say, that's my typical bedtime. And it then goes through this awesome sort of downstroke in terms of concentration. And then a few hours before you wake up, cortisol will start to rise. In other words, it's a preparatory hormone that starts to get you ready for wakefulness. If you look at patients with insomnia, however, what you see is that their cortisol starts to come down nicely in the evening, sort of 6 or 7 or 8. So, they could feel just as sleepy as a regular person. But then right before bed, it goes back in the opposite direction. It spikes again and then starts to come down. And then often in the middle of the night, you will see cortisol spike back again when it should be lower still before it starts its rise. Those two cortisol spikes, I think, are the natural biological bookmarks for what we call sleep onset insomnia and sleep maintenance insomnia. So your cortisol spikes just before bed, you can't fall asleep. Sleep onset insomnia. Cortisol spikes in the middle of the night, you wake up, Rolodex of anxiety in brain starts to happen. Cortisol spikes, you can't fall back asleep. That's what we call sleep maintenance insomnia. Those are the two principal types of insomnia. I think that's where you can see part of the biological basis. And my guess is that if we were to measure, things like your heart rate variability, and we were to decompose them with some mathematical equations that you would know of, things like a fast Fourier transform, you can look at the contribution of the sympathetic versus parasympathetic when you break down the heart rate variability. My guess is that you're going to see that sympathetic, that fight or flight branch of the nervous system getting jacked just before sleep onset, and then once again spiking in the middle of the night, underlying the cortisol spike, which underlies the awakening, which underlies the syndrome of insomnia.
Yeah. Who do you think in that equation, I don't want to give everyone a lecture on this topic because you've done a great job explaining what sympathetic is, right? Which is autonomic, but it's sort of different from the glucocorticoid regulated pathway. Do you think that the sympathetic is driving the glucocorticoid or the other way around? And the only reason I ask is in a moment, I'm going to propose the only two things that I've ever really thought I have in the toolkit to treat that. But the answer to this question might impact that as well.
I honestly don't think we have the evidence to argue which way round that chain of command unfolds. I just genuinely don't know of the evidence. I think both are tenable hypotheses. Both could be independent, so I think they could be non-mutually exclusive. So in truth, I don't think I know the evidence in favor. But what's nice is that the fact that we know that they both happen and can be causal contributors means that we've got at least two treatment targets that we can go after, which I think will then play into exactly what you're going to say, which...
Well, I don't know that they're correct, but to me, when we see that pattern, because we do measure nighttime cortisol and we measure the metabolites of it and all of these other complicated assays, when we see that high nighttime cortisol, we basically, that's a very hard problem to treat because if you really think about it, we're just dealing with the endocrine system, right? It's a heck of a lot easier to treat thyroid dysfunction and dysfunction of the sex hormones. And I'm not saying that those things are easy, but they are easier than treating the upper end of the, like when you have low sympathetic function and low glucocorticoid function, that's actually easier to treat than the opposite. The hardest problem, I think, in clinical medicine from an endocrine perspective is high sympathetic output, high glucocorticoid output. And really, it's amenable to behavioral therapy, right? It really comes down to a change in mindset and a change in routine. We were talking about this earlier. It's like the further I can separate bed from email, the better. Because for me, email is just, I hate emails so much. So anytime I'm looking at email.
Everyone else's agenda for your time.
Yeah. I have a low level of pissed offedness whenever I'm looking at email. So the further I can separate my pissed offedness from bed, the less my cortisol is.
Can I get that t-shirt, by the way?
Yeah. And then the second thing, which appears to work anecdotally, is phosphatidylserine at a high enough dose, which generally requires about 400 to 600 milligrams. And again, for me, the only time I find that that's really necessary is under those jet lag circumstances, when you're trying to put yourself in the time zone of London, when you're leaving San Francisco, and you basically have to make yourself go to bed, and it's only 2 p.m. in your brain, but it's late enough there. Slamming yourself with 600 of phosphatidylserine really seems to move the needle, both in terms of your glucose response and your cortisol response. What else do you have up your sleeve on that particular problem? Because honestly, I can't think of a more difficult clinical problem than the one you've just described.
I think the glucocorticoid issue is a really tough nut to crack. I think for the sympathetic drive, I do think you're correct that it's behavioral. There, I would actually argue meditation. And I looked at this data when I was researching the book. Gosh, this must have been about 4 years ago now. And I think I'm a bit of a hard-nosed, dyed-in-the-wool scientist. So when I was reading the studies on meditation and insomnia, I was wondering if it was a bit woo-woo and didn't know how to take it seriously. But the data was very compelling in terms of it really does decrease the amount of time it takes someone to fall asleep. The continuity of their sleep is improved. If you look at some of these apps that do it very well, and things like Headspace or Calm, my guess, although I don't know if they've ever released this data, is that if you were to look at their usage statistics, you will already see that people are self-medicating their insomnia by way of meditating right before bed. And I think, both of those apps are starting to now launch, aspects of sleep and sleep health in their portfolio of offerings, rightly so, because they've probably realized that sleep is a huge part of the issue for which people are coming to them to solve. And the clinical data is very supportive of that. So I would say that for driving, it's almost impossible to fall asleep if your autonomic nervous system is pushed in a sympathetic dominant state, in a fight or flight state. And a good example of this is, when you are jet lagged, you can be there. You may not have slept on the plane. You can feel that you're tired. You're really tired. But for some reason, your cortisol is now spiking because you're mismatched with your circadian rhythm. You can feel your heart rate, and you can just know that your nervous system is cranked, and you are tired as tired can be in your eyes and in your mind. But your nervous system, because it's on that sort of upward swing, will not let you fall asleep. But meditation, I think, is a great way to drive a parasympathetic dominance of the nervous system, which is to take you out of the fight or flight branch and more into this quiet, sort of more introspective state. I think that's probably the better thing. Now, I know it's not from a clinical medical perspective as desirable because it's not a pill that we can take. It's not a dosage. You just have to put in the work to sit there and meditate.